A lot of people have been requesting this video. A lot of people want to know a lot about Zoroastrianism. And the main reason for that is once you really start digging into the religion yourself, you can see how highly conscious it is. I mean, Zoroastrianism, the teachings are so conscious, and it really makes you look at the religion like, what did they know and how did this religion not survive? Because it makes so much sense. We're going to really have to look at the history of the Persian people. As I said, talked about this in the videos before, ancient history series, and part 1 of ancient religions. You got to really get into history and where people come from. So we know Zoroastrianism goes back to the Persian Empire. And I talked about the history of these people and what it goes back to and the teachings that they had, and basically how they came about as far as the people. So Zoroastrianism, Persian Empire, we know Iran is basically the remnants of the old Persian Empire. And we got into this whole thing. So just to elaborate, you have to understand, one, the ancient Egyptian empire fell first to the Persians. So we have to look at how did this happen? When you look at the Persian Empire and them growing up and growing in numbers, and how were they able to still conquer and challenge the Egyptians and sustain, sustain them conquering the Egyptians for so long? Because everybody that came into Kemet, if they managed to conquer the Egyptians eventually will overthrow them. They will eventually have civil war and fight for years and years. And we know when the Persians finally took over, the Egyptians fought for about 70 years until, it was finally done. And the Persians finally got a hold on the Egyptian people. And it's not coincidence that once they got that hold, the Greeks came in and took the whole entire thing from them. So, and that's part of what this whole thing is about. We got to get into the Greek aspect of the Persian people. And as I talked about in those videos, it's far-fetched and hard for people to believe when you get into the whole thing. I know a lot of people contact me about it, and when they start really digging into it, they could see how what I was explaining was real. So first thing is, the people we call the Persian people, modern day Iran, are a creation, basically. So understand the powers that be, the hierarchy of the Greeks or whoever is controlling the powers that be, understood that they could not come into Kemet and simply use the Greeks to conquer the Egyptians, because they were learning from the Egyptians. They were coming in there and the people loved the Egyptians. So what they would do is a series of breeding. So they would go north of Greece and breed to create the Macedonians. They will also go over to what we know as Iraq and create the Persian Empire. So, talked about before, you have the Aryans coming down from the north. Now, the Aryans would mix in with the people of the Indus Valley and the people in India. They would mix in with those people and create the Persian people. This is where they come from. So you also have to understand that the Indus Valley were basically people, Africans coming from Ethiopia mostly, and traveling over to India. They would become the Indus Valley civilization. They would also become, the people of India. So you had this mixing of the Aryans coming down, mixing in with the Indus Valley, mixing in with Ethiopians, mixing in with Indians. And you have this mixture. These are the Persian people once they all come together and they all mixing together. This was deliberately done, and that empire was deliberately created and established to later conquer, so that people could not see the true plans of the Aryans. So picture this, just think about it. You have the Aryans coming down, you have white people coming down, and they're coming into different civilizations in Africa and learning. They're coming in and learning. The people that was traveling with them, the other white people, that are just the regular people, whether they knew or not the true agenda of the hierarchy, we don't know. But the true agenda was eventually to take these lands, to learn from these people and take their shit, plain and simple. So you can't just have different skirmishes. You can't have, the Aryans coming into one part, conquering and taking over, coming into this part, conquering and taking over. The word would get out. So what they would do was mix in, play a nice role, and eventually take the throne, eventually conquer from within. That was their MO. That's how they did their thing. So something on the scale of what they were planning could not get out. So they bred these people and they set them, built the empire. And eventually, the Greeks would give them the keys to the back door for Egypt, and they would come into Egypt, conquer the Egyptians, and the Greeks would basically take over later from the Persians. So the whole story we have of Alexander and everything and the wars and all that, we do not know is true. We can't really prove much of it. We don't know exactly what happened, but we can see through history that the Persians, yes, conquered the Egyptians. The Greeks conquered the Persians and took the Egyptian empire, which, as I said, the Greeks was living with the Egyptians. So once you took back the Egyptian empire, why not then give it back to its rightful people, the Egyptians? Which shows you their plan all along, the Greeks, was to take that land. And they bred the Persians to do exactly that for them. So same thing you had in the Macedonians. You have one already the Minoans, which are the original Black Greeks, being conquered by these Aryans coming down from the north. And they would basically breed and slowly take over the Minoans. Now, the mindset of people back then was not black-white. They understood who these people were. So we can't just say this and that. But that's essentially what it was, the whites conquering all the dark-skinned land. So you have the Minoans eventually, being slowly conquered. And when they talk about in history, the wars between the Athenians and the Spartans, we look at all this Greek history and a civil war between the Greeks. That's bullshit. That's a lie to cover up what it really was. It was the white Greeks versus the Black Greeks, plain and simple, taking over. Again, there's no way in the world that you have the Greeks doing everything they're doing as far as the Athenians being so, intelligent and having society and so on and so forth. There's no way they could not know up north the Macedonians had amassed an entire empire and kingdom that was basically coming to rival them and take their shit. So it's basically what happened. It's the same thing with the Persians. There's no way in the world nobody could have seen or couldn't have seen the Persian Empire growing as big as it grown and not, say something about it. So the Greeks knew exactly what they was doing. The Africans in North Africa, the Egyptians, were basically slaves to these people. So they had no clue to really do anything about it, once they got conquered. So we know eventually the Greeks would stab the Persians in the back. And this would later lead to the Persian Empire basically coming together and rising up and coming at the Roman Empire, which was now in control of the lands that the Persians once had. Rome came and basically combined with Greece, and the Persians fought them for hundreds of years, as history shows us. That's something we can prove. So we know that. But before all this happened, it's almost like a prequel. It's almost like a prequel, like, the Star Wars saga, where you had the end movies first and then you have the beginning movies later. So this is basically what this is. You have to go back and you got to look at the beginning. Before all that happened, you had to understand, one, what took place with the Persian Empire. How did they get that whole thing off the ground? And what did they teach these people to, one, not only, conquer themselves or do something like what the Greeks was trying to do, but to basically keep control of these people. And that's one of the things that when we look at, we're not going to find too much information on, but we can kind of sort of, from the facts that we do know, determine that this is exactly what happened, what I'm going to explain. So one of the things is this. You got to go and look at the bloodline of the Persian people. So for anybody who has any doubts of where the Persians come from, because you'll have Persian people who think they are just a race that has always existed, like Africans. Same thing with Mexicans, the same thing with Puerto Ricans. They think that their race is thousands and thousands and thousands of years old when it is not. You have to understand what happened and how the mixing in of the Aryans with Black people, and then in different parts of the world, you have different climates that causes skin color, skin pigmentation to increase or decrease, which creates the different races that we know on the planet. Fact. So people got to understand, one. So when you try to trace back the Persian Empire, the Persian people, I should say, we know they just drop off at some point in history and they don't know where they come from. So you have, and one of the reasons you can tell this is all Greek doing is you have the mythology of the Persian people. Like they're surrounded by mythology, Greek mythology. So we can see what's going on here. So when you look at the chart here, because you have Darius, Darius talks about the lineage of his family going back to Archimedes. And then you look at Archimedes and there is nothing else. It stops there. So we have to go into where did he come from and who is he? And this is Persian we're talking about. So mind you, this whole thing follows the same type of scenario as Greek mythology. So we look at Plato. And Plato tells us in Alcibiades, this is Alcibiades right here. Plato was saying here, Archimedes was the founder of the dynasty, which ruled Persia until the conquest by Alexander the Great. Herodotus gives a list of Archimedes' descendants down to Xerxes. Scroll down here real quick. It says, for the closest connection of Zeus to Archimedes was that Archimedes was a Persian, and the Persians were supposedly descended from Perseus, the son of Perseus, the son of Zeus. Now, Archimedes' mother is Andromeda, who is the Ethiopian queen. So you had the same scenario, the same type of situations with Andromeda and Perseus as you had with Sheba, Queen Sheba, and King Solomon. These are all biblical things. And as I showed you, this goes back to Greeks. The Greeks created this stuff. So remember, all the paintings that they show of Andromeda with Perseus, she's white, when she's clearly Ethiopian. And you have some depictions of her being black, but they changed all of those to her being white. So we know they tried to basically whitewash, a long time ago. And a lot of these paintings are very old, hundreds of years old. And they still painted her white, when she's clearly from Ethiopia. And show me a white civilization that's in Ethiopia. So we know what was going on here. It was the same thing with Solomon and Queen Sheba. So you have this whole thing where they know what's up with the history and where these people come from, but they try to whitewash it. So we're not going to really get into much the Greek mythology aspect of it because it's a lot, but understand them trying to basically explain where the Persians came from. When they do, it goes back to Greek mythology and saying that these people are basically descendants of Greek mythological people, which is basically telling you straight up that the Greeks created them. It's basically what they're saying. So when you go back and start to look at that, you'll find a lot of information about that. And it's confusing if you get caught all up in that. It'll take away from Zoroastrianism itself. So you got to look at Zarathustra or Zoroaster, however you want to pronounce his name, or whatever name you want to use. He's the one you got to look at. He's the one you really got to look at and follow his history, which again, we can't really get too much into because it goes back to his clan, and then we don't have too much information about them as well. So you got to look at that, and you got to look at everything else that's suspicious that surrounds the religion, basically all to cover up the fact that it was created by the Greeks, the same as Islam, the same as Christianity, the same as Judaism. These are all Greek religions created. It's just with Zoroastrianism, it gives you way more insight. It's more on the forefront of what the hidden meaning of Christianity and Judaism is showing us. So in Zoroastrianism, is more out there as far as the fact that Christianity is talking about consciousness and so on and so forth. It's more out there in Zoroastrian belief. So it's saying here, Zarathustra or Zoroaster, family and formative years. Sometime during the 15th or 12th centuries before the Common Era, BCE, and maybe during the 13th century, there lived a Irano-Aryan clan. Think about that. Named Spitama, which means white or very white. They dwelled in Ariana, Veja. The original Aryan homeland was comprised the Euro-Asian steppes between the Volga River and southwestern Siberia, and Spitamas may have lived in northwestern Kazakhstan near the present Russian border. So right from the bat, they're giving you that connection with the Aryans and these people. And you have the Irano-Aryan people or Irano-Aryan clan, just basically telling you just the Aryans mix with these people from Iran, just the Persians, basically what it's saying. So you have to look at the whole story of Zoroaster, which we'll get into a little bit, with his mom. So his mom, Dagdova, which basically means milkmaid. So their names are weird. So Dagdova, his mom, she basically lived in the same You might as well say like the same town as Zoroaster's dad. And what happened was, she was young. She was a young teenager who was considered to be like very beautiful, like so beautiful that was out of the ordinary how beautiful she looked. They say she had like a white glow to her. And during her teenage years, like her town or her village, fell sick. Like everybody was getting sick and ill, and she was fine. Nothing was wrong with her. So they say she was doing some kind of, witch spell or some kind of voodoo stuff to them, making everybody sick because she wanted to, she felt like everybody was ugly or something like that.